What's up, cooks? Welcome to the Card Kitchen. I am the Card Chef, and today we are cooking up the top 10 decks of the week and a meta report breaking down the win rate and meta share of all the top decks in the game today. That's right, we're doing a meta report on top of the top 10 decks of the week. So let's start with the meta report. And this is how I've broken it down. I've broken it down between Blaine decks, water decks, Dark decks, Pikachu decks, Moltres decks, Celebi decks, and Mewtwo decks. And then anything outside of that is considered other. So as you can see on the chart, you have just a Pokemon card back. That is other. That is all other decks outside of these archetypes. And then of course we have the Blaine to represent the Blaine decks, the Misty to represent the water decks, the Weezing to represent the dark decks, because most dark decks that have done good in the meta since the beginning till now, even though those decks have changed now, usually consist of at least Weezing, and of course the Pikachu EX decks, Moltres decks, which are Charizard Moltres, Arcanine Moltres, or Charizard and Arcanine. Then of course we have the new Celebi representing the green part of the pie, and then the Mewtwo EX, which of course is the Mewtwo Gardevoir, and now taking in things such as Mew, and sometimes not even playing the Mew at all, and still playing the standard Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir with things like even just a Jinx. But this breakdown right here, this first one that we see, is the meta share. And as you can see, the Blaine decks only represent about 2% overall of the meta share. And just to let you know, I've only looked at tournaments that consist of 200 or more people. Anything outside of that, I did not calculate any of the meta share. So as you can see, like I said, the Blaine is only about 2% overall of the meta share, which is interesting because Blaine is kind of doing pretty decent right now, especially with all the Celebi that we see. Next up, we have the Misty or Water decks. These decks, the ones I looked at specifically, are Starmie Articuno decks, Starmie Greninja, Articuno Greninja, Gyarados Greninja, Gyarados Articuno, or Gyarados Starmie. And then all other decks outside of that, even Vaporeon variants or Blastoise variants, I completely left out and only calculated the ones I just mentioned, and that's only about a 12% meta share. And then up next, we have the Weezing or Dark decks. And the only decks I actually looked at for this are the new Scolipede and Weezing decks, because these decks have been all over the tournament scene right now and are getting a ton of tops. I have not seen one win a tournament yet. However, I think this deck has probably topped almost more than any other deck overall within the first week of this new release of Mythical Island. So that's pretty interesting. And this has a 9% meta share. And then the Pikachu EX has about a 13% meta share, which is a significant drop because usually before this, it was around the 20% meta share range. Moltres decks have dropped tremendously. This used to be around a 17 to 20% meta share, now down to an 8. And I think this makes sense because there's so much more water. And the fire decks, even though they're strong against Celebi, the Charizard variants are hard to get online right now because a lot of these decks are very fast. Even the Celebi EX can get online very fast and take these big Charizard decks out before they even get going. And then we have the Celebi decks at around 11%, which is kind of shocking. And it could be because I've looked at around 9 tournaments. Some tournaments may be higher than others. But when you're on ladder outside of tournaments, this is the only deck I see about 90% of the time. So it's interesting to see that the Celebi EX is only around 11% of the meta share. And then we have the Mewtwo EX, which is still around 26, which I believe that's exactly kind of where it was at before Mythical Island came out anyway. So this deck is still being played a ton. And with that being said, let's get into the win rate portion of this breakdown. So now we are at the win rate portion of this breakdown, and it's really interesting to see because even though some decks have a much lower meta share than others, the win rates are all kind of around similar areas. So as you can see, we'll start with the Mewtwo EX, which is the largest meta share. It's only about overall a 41% win rate, and this be due to a bunch of different things. It could be due to matchups, it could be due to different variants, some playing Mew EX, some others not, some others playing the Jinx, or things like that. And then as you get into the Celebi EX, which has a very low part of the meta share, which was only about 11%, a win rate is 46%, which is actually higher than the Mewtwo EX variants. And then when you get into water, this is probably the most shocking one. This has the highest win rate of all decks right now in tournaments with 200 or more people, with 54%. And I think we can account that for the Gyarados. The Gyarados decks are doing tremendously well, and even though those are doing well, some of the older variants with the Greninja variants with Articuno or Starmie are still doing very well as well. And then as we get into the Weezing Scolipede decks, they are at around a 49% win rate. The Pikachu EX is around a 50%. So this deck, even though this is probably the meta deck that I see less often now on the regular ladder within the game, it still has a pretty decent win rate of 50%. And then we get into the Blaine decks, and these are around 43%. And then the Charizard decks are at 41%. Now, even though this is overall win rate, it doesn't mean that some of these decks with lower win rates aren't still winning tournaments more often than others. In fact, what we're going to do now is we're going to get into a different chart that shows us which decks are actually topping more often than others, regardless of the win rate, as well as decks that are actually winning tournaments. So now we are in the portion of the amount or the percentage of these decks that are topping in top 16s amongst tournaments that are 200 or more people. And let's start with the water variants of these decks. The Misty decks or water decks are topping around 24% of the time, and that is a humongous amount. It's almost the biggest amount on this list, aside from the Pikachu, which we'll get into in a minute. The next one up are the Scolipede decks, or the dark decks with Weezing in them, and they are topping around 9% of the time. Outside of all these archetypes that we specifically are looking at, the other portion, the decks that aren't these archetypes, are topping about only 3% of the time, which is interesting because the other percentage of decks that is the meta share was around 21%, but only 3% of the time do any of those other decks that we don't normally see or consider meta decks are only making the top cut around 3% of the time. And then we have the Mewtwo EX, which is really interesting to see at a 19% top rate, because as you saw, the overall win rate of those decks were only about 41% compared to some other decks that were much higher, the Pikachu and water decks being a lot higher, which they are still higher in the top range, but Mewtwo EX was one of the lower win rates on that piece of the pie, but they are still topping 19% of the time. The Celebi decks are only topping around 6% of the time. So again, as much as we see this deck on ladder all the time, or at least I do, I don't know what y'all think, but I know it's the deck I see pretty much 90% of the time on ladder. It's only topping top 16s around 6% of the time. And then the Pikachu decks, which has a lower win rate than the water decks overall, is still topping more than any other deck in the game at 29%, at least within the last week and since the release of Mythical Island, in tournaments with 200 or more people. And then the Blaine decks are only topping around 1% of the time. And then the Moltres decks are only topping around 8% of the time. Now what we're going to look at is which decks are actually winning tournaments more often than the others. Of course, some of these decks aren't going to appear on here at all. So let's get into that. So now we are in the portion of the meta breakdown where we see which decks have won tournaments, not just topped or the meta shares or anything like that, but who actually won. And anyone on here that has 11% means they won one of the 9 tournaments that I looked at. If it's 22%, they won 2, and if it's 33%, they won 3. As you can see, the Dark and Blaine decks are not on here at all, even though they got tops, and I've been looking at them because they're very popular decks that people seem to be using. They did not win any tournaments. The first one we're going to look at is the other portion, and we will show that deck that won a tournament that we did not consider as looking at for specifically that archetype, and it won a tournament. Outside of that, the Mewtwo, Celebi, and Moltres decks only won 1 tournament each, which is pretty cool because we are seeing, even though there is a huge diversity and a different meta share and top-in rate for all decks across the board, some decks still win regardless of win rate, meta share, and top rate. And then we get into the Misty decks or the Water decks that won 2 tournaments this week. And again, this can be attributed to the new Gyarados, and we'll get into that deck in a moment as well. And then we got Pikachu, who of course has one of the higher win rates, has one of the highest top rates, and of course the more times a deck tops, especially in one tournament, the more likely it is going to win as well. This could also be because if the other majority of the tops is something like water, which is weak to electric, you're definitely going to see electric win more often than not, because the other huge portion of the top 16s, you'll more likely be playing the decks that you're really strong against, which of course is water. Now with that being said, let's get into the top 10 decks of the week. First deck we're going to talk about is this Golem deck, and I can't believe it. Golem and Fighting made its way into a first place finish, and not only that, it did it in the Ursi Day 1500 plus person tournament. And the deck breakdown is as this: the 2 Golem lines, 2 Druddigon, 1 Hitmonlee, 1 Marshadow, 2 Brock, 2 Leaf, 2 Professor's Research, 1 Giovanni, 2 Pokeball, and 1 Potion. Now this deck is really interesting, and honestly I think overall this week the #1 card that is probably the MVP of all decks and all packs and cards in the game is probably Druddigon. This card has been used in 2 of the top decks this week and is doing tremendously well with its rough skin ability. So this deck is basically saying, I'm going to stay on the field for as long as I can, getting damage for free with my Druddigon, not allow you to knock me out with my 160 HP. Not even a Mewtwo can do it. It's also not weak to Psychic. It's only weak to Grass, and it takes 30 less damage from attacks. And because you're a single prize deck, it takes a long time to get this deck off the board and win those games. You're also playing things like Hitmonlee and Marshadow at 1 each, which are tremendous tech cards, because if you get something low enough and it has to retreat and go onto the bench, Hitmonlee can just finish it off. And not only that, if once you get your Druddigon or your Golem or whatever it is knocked out, you can bring in that Marshadow, get the revenge kill with its revenge attack, and hit for 100 damage and just win the game. Of course we're playing Brox because we're playing Golem, and of course we're playing Leafs because a lot of your main Pokemon that you're going to have out in the forefront have 2 or more retreat costs. You're going to be playing those Pokeballs and those Professor's Research because obviously you're playing those in every deck. We're also going to be playing a Giovanni to hit those specific breakpoints for when you need them, and then the potion to keep those cards like Druddigon and Golem on the field for an extra turn so you can possibly sweep the game. The one thing that's super duper surprising in this deck is no Sabrina. This deck is really cool, and the fact that it won the biggest tournament of the week and the biggest tournament of almost every week is the Earthsea Day one. This is really cool and something to look into, especially since we just went through the meta deck breakdown with the meta shares, the top rates, the win rates, and Pikachu seems to be at the top of almost every single one of those. So when you're hitting for weakness against that, you're always going to do well. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. The next deck we are looking at is another Druddigon deck, and this is why I'm saying it is the MVP of the week, and it's in a Gyarados Greninja deck. So Water has had a super interesting arc in the meta. The Starmie EX Articuno decks that people originally played in the meta were not really making the cut. They were good, they were very fast and strong, but they just could not compete. These decks started to evolve into Greninja decks, specifically being either the Starmie Greninja or the Articuno Greninja. Now that Gyarados is here with its 140 attack, it has changed the game. We now have this water Pokemon that could do massive damage instead of decent, good damage for low energy really quickly. But the issue with those decks is they didn't have a great end game. But now what we're doing is we're taking the Druddigon, we're putting it in the front line, we're stacking damage on Pokemon, forcing that damage on them so we can get to those breakpoints on things like Mewtwo and Charizard, so that when we do attack with our Gyarados, we can knock those Pokemon out. And even if we don't get that damage with the Druddigon, we can make up for it in the end with a Greninja. You can put a 2 damage counters on something like a Mewtwo with your Greninja and then knock it out with your Gyarados, which is why we are not playing Giovanni's. As important as that 150 damage range is, we do not need the Giovanni's in this deck. And so we are playing 2 Gyarados lines, 2 Greninja lines, and 2 Druddigon. We are playing 12 Pokemon. That is a lot. And then 6 supporters and only 2 item cards. So this is a deck that could be very vulnerable to something like a red card. However, it did win a tournament. It also got second place in another. This deck is super duper strong, and I love that we are seeing new cards, new decks, and new archetypes winning tournaments such as Water, new cards like Druddigon and Gyarados doing really well in the meta. Of course, we're playing the Misties, and of course, we're playing the Leaf, because again, the main Pokemon you have in the forefront, your Druddigon or Gyarados, have a very high retreat cost. As you may also see, this is not a Vaporeon build. Vaporeon builds are not doing as well as this Druddigon Greninja deck, and I think this will probably be the deck going forward. However, now that we've seen this past week go by, and we're seeing that Pikachu is also already super high in the meta, and Water is as well, we might see even more Pikachu now, which means these decks might just start to fall off again. Only time will tell. And with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So the next deck on the list is a Celebi deck, and there's 2 decks that seem to be being played with Celebi, and it's the obviously both Celebi and Superior are in any of the main Celebi decks. And then there's also decks that play either Executor EX, the new Executor, or a Delmise. This one, however, specifically with the Executor EX, won a tournament, and that tournament specifically was the NH Kuro Community Tournament with 256 people, and it won the tournament. So as you can tell, it's a very standard Celebi deck with 2 Superior lines, 2 Celebi EX, the 2 Erica, and then all the good stuff that helps the deck out. Obviously, Sabrina, Pokeballs, and Professor's Research, and then the 1 X Speed. But, of course, the most interesting part of this deck is the Executor EX, which I think is really smart, because when we were seeing grass decks in general doing good, they always usually had the Executor EX, and because it's such an aggressive stage 1 Pokemon with a lot of HP that you can heal up, keep on as a super good aggressive attacker with a tanky HP that you can heal with Erica, so you can build your Celebi up in the back, as well as evolve into your Superior. And then once that Celebi is online, has a ton of energy, you're just going to sweep the game. Now, I am surprised that we don't see a Leaf in this deck, but at the same time, I'm also not, because the X Speed plus 1 energy already gets that Executor out from the front, so you can bring in that Celebi EX and start to sweep games. I'm glad that this deck was able to get a win, even if it didn't win as often as other decks, because this is a new archetype and it is a very strong deck. Once Celebi's flipping 6 to 8 to sometimes 10 coins, you're basically never going to lose the game. And with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. The next deck we want to talk about is good old Pikachu EX. This deck is still doing super duper good. It won 3 tournaments this week. It has one of the highest win rates, one of the highest win meta shares, as well as one of the highest top rates, and of course has the highest finish rate, meaning it finished the first place in the majority of tournaments that I looked at, with 9 tournaments with 200 or more people. We're going to look at this build specifically, and it's the Electrode Pikachu build that tacked in the new Dedenne. And it must be said that all 3 decks that won for Pikachu this week were actually 3 different variants, and they're the same old variants that we usually see. It's the Electro variant, the Raichu variant, not the new one, the old Raichu, and the Zebstrika. Each of those decks got a win, but what they have in common is the 7th basic in the deck is now Dedenne, which is what we all predicted. I would have liked to have seen if Pikachu changed a little bit more, maybe add in something like the new Joltik and its evolution, but it didn't seem to happen. In fact, it's just the same deck being replaced with the Dedenne. The specific one we're looking at is the one that I wanted to showcase, because I think this deck is probably the most aggressive, and I think you kind of want to have the aggressive approach when you're playing with Pikachu. If you can't get that Pikachu out, you can still be aggressive with your Electrode or buy time with your Dedenne. This deck I also like more than the Raichu build, because you allow yourself to play additional trainers when you don't need to be playing the Lieutenant Surge. The Zebstrika build I do like as well, because you can snipe, but again, this one just has so much versatility. It's the fastest, most aggressive one. You also get that benefit of the Electrode having a free retreat cost. But this deck doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It's still topping, it's still winning, and even though we see it less on ladder, it's still doing tremendously well, and might continue to do even better if the Gyarados builds start to come out even more and more. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. The next deck on the list is, of course, good old Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir. Now, as you can tell, the second card I have on the screen is the Mew EX. However, the deck list does not have it, and it's for two reasons. One being that Mew EX does seem to be in the majority of builds in the game right now for Mew EX and Gardevoir. However, the deck list on the screen is the only deck list that actually won a tournament with 200 or more people, which is super duper interesting. So it makes me think a couple of things. One, is Mew EX actually better in this deck or not? In fact, I actually think the best build is a mix of these two. I think because now we are playing the mythical slabs, even though we're already playing a lot of psychic Pokemon, I think you still want to be playing around 10 or 50% of your deck so you can maximize the value of actually hitting something with your mythical slab. So I think the right build, even though this one won and the majority of them are playing Mew EX, is to play both one Mew EX and one Jinx. The Jinx is super important, which makes me which is why I can tell that this deck won, because you're seeing so much Celebi EX, and you need to be able to have that card like Jinx that could do a ton of damage against a Celebi that has a ton of energy attached to it because of something like a Superior. This deck also doesn't have to play things like Button Expeditioner, which a lot of people like to play when they're playing the Mew EX. So it will be interesting to see if the best versions of this deck are actually playing Mew EX or not. What I can say is, outside of Druddigon, which I've already dubbed the MVP of this week, I do believe Mew EX is the #2 MVP of the week, because he's not just being played in Mewtwo EX decks, he is being teched into a ton of decks. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So the next deck we're going to look at is the Arcanine Moltres deck. This deck was the one deck that came out very late after the release, where people started to realize that Arcanine EX is a little bit better than we originally thought. And that was until we decided to combine the Charizard and Arcanine into the Moltres deck together. However, it does seem like this deck is back and better than ever. In fact, it won a 688-person tournament, the Pocket Legends League number 12, and it did it with this deck. So this deck is super interesting because, again, it's being tacked in with the Mew EX, which I guess is the replacement for Charizard. Because now that we have the Mew EX, we only need to require it to be a basic, have 3 energy, and we can still do a ton of damage like the Charizard would have done anyways by copying things like Mewtwo EX's attack and Charizard EX's attack. And of course, this deck is also really strong right now because it still knocks out a ton of cards in the game. Zapdos, Pikachu, Celebi, which is everywhere, Mew EX, which is everywhere with 130. So when you're attacking for 120 with your Arcanine EX, as well as playing a Giovanni, you are just getting a ton of tremendous value. And then you can bring in that Mew EX, which you took time to build in the back row, after you've already used your Moltres to fill up your Arcanine to sweep the game. This deck seems to be the new best version of Fire or Moltres decks in general. So it would be interesting to see where Fire decks go in the future, especially since we're seeing so much more water. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So the next deck that we want to talk about is a Charizard EX deck. So this is the standard Charizard EX build with the Moltres, the baby Charizard, no Arcanine in there, but it's again Tekken and the Mew EX. Now this deck did not win any tournaments this week, but it is interesting to see that it's still doing well. It did still top in multiple tournaments and is topping with Tekken in the Mew EX. And again, this is why Mew EX is one of those MVPs of the week, because it's just being played in everything as a tech card. I personally still like it better in just the Arcanine build, because again, the Mew EX kind of acts like that big attacker for Charizard or in placement of Charizard, but this deck seems to be doing both, playing the Charizard and the Mew. So it'd be interesting to see if this continues to happen, if we can afford to be playing both of these in the same deck, or if the Arcanine build will be the only one we are playing. But with that being said, let's get in to the next deck. So the next deck on the list is the Scolipede Weezing deck, and this deck seems to have completely replaced the Arbok Weezing decks. In fact, it's even replaced the Wigglytuff variants, and so basically we've replaced the Arbok and Wigglytuff with the Scolipede line and the new Tauros. So this is something that I had predicted, that at the very least, the Wigglytuffs would be replaced with something like the Tauros, because the dark decks, usually before this, the Arbok, Weezing, Wigglytuffs, seem to kind of be like that anti-meta or meta counter. So now that we have the Tauros EX, the new Tauros that counters the EX Pokemon specifically, allowing you to do 120 damage to an EX, I figured it would be put into these decks. What I did not predict is that Scolipede would be so strong, even though it has 140 HP and a 2 energy requirement attack. Because it was a stage 2, I did not expect it to see it this early in the meta. I still thought the Arbok decks would still be playing alongside Weezing and just Tekken in the Tauros, but this deck is doing very well. It has topped over 13 times in the 9 tournaments that I looked at with 200 or more people, and it seems to be doing very well. It has not won a tournament yet, but again, this is like the standard anti-meta or meta counter deck, and I don't think it's going to go anywhere, so it'd be interesting to see where it goes in the future if something starts to change. As we saw in the Arbok Weezing decks, it slowly started to change and adding in things like the Wigglytuff, so it would be cool to see what the future looks like for this deck. And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So the next deck we want to talk about is the new Blaine deck, and this is super interesting because I wasn't sure if this deck was going to do well or how it would do compared to the original Blaine deck, and it seems like there isn't a definitive answer yet, because in a lot of the tournaments that I looked at, not only are the Blaine decks and the new and the old playing either the old Rapidash or the new Rapidash, because that's really the main difference between the two decks. In a lot of those tournaments I looked at, the either one have the same play rate or the same win rate. So that is super cool and interesting to see. These decks, that does not seem as of yet which one is the best. I still personally like the original build with the original Rapidash. It's cheaper. You want this deck to be as aggressive as possible and to be able to take out decks before they get anything going. The one thing that was interesting about this deck specifically that made a top is it is playing the new Magmar, which I do not like. I don't like that you have to discard 2 energy in order to do 80, even with the Blaine only doing 110. That doesn't even knock out a Pikachu. However, this deck did get a top, so it's interesting to see. What I would like to do and what I will do the next time we do a top 10 list is specifically look at which ones are actually doing better. Is it the old Rapidash and Blaine or the new Rapidash and Blaine? And with that being said, let's get into the next deck. So the next deck we want to talk about is this new fighting deck, and there have been a couple of tops with the similar type of build outside of the Golem deck that we looked at the beginning of the top 10. decks. But what surprises me about this is it's not playing the promo Mankey or the old Primeape. It's playing the new Mankey and the new Primeape. And what's cool about that card is it does, for 1 energy, does 50 damage. So this deck has said, I just want to be as aggressive as I possibly can, get prizes, and win the game as quickly as possible. And with all the Pikachu decks still out there, this deck might do tremendously well. And even when it's not, before this deck and before the new Primeape, the standard 40 damage for 1 energy plus the Giovanni doing a 40 plus 10, doing 50 damage was already kind of good. But now that you can do a 50 plus 10 and knock out those basic Pokemon with 60 HP, it's even more valuable because a lot of the basic Pokemon, especially ones that evolve into other Pokemon, have that 60 HP instead of that 50 HP. So this deck is really interesting because of that specifically. Again, we're playing things like Hitmonlee to snipe and get prizes from your opponent's bench. You're playing that Marshadow because that Marshadow can get that revenge attack for 100 damage, get you extra prize points. And then we're playing the one of Aerodactyl. Again, I've said this so many times, I don't think we're playing this for the ability, we're playing it for the attack. If that ability ever does come into effect, it's really just a cherry on top. But we're really playing this for the 2 energy, 80 damage attack, the Land Crush attack, for being able to hit for 80 damage just for 2 energy with the 140 HP is pretty decent, especially in a fighting type deck when you're going to be seeing a lot of electric. We are of course going to be playing double Giovanni because again that 50 plus 10. They're also playing a blue because not only do we want to get those breakpoints with Giovanni, we want to avoid the breakpoints back on us by playing that blue and working around those breakpoints. But anyways, with that being said, that's it for the top 10 decks of the week. Like, subscribe, and share, and leave a comment in the comment section below. And as always, keep cooking.